Okay, howdy everyone. Talking at you Monday at the beginning of our fourth week in Survey of Rhetorical Studies here. So second to last week, and we are coming out of a week thinking about rhetoric as public confrontation. That conception of rhetoric really tracks with what was happening in the 60s, 70s, social rights movements, thinking about environmentalism, thinking about feminism, students' rights, civil rights of all kinds. They tended to take the shape of public confrontation, right? So how we talked about publics coming together, matters of common concern, using discourse, using arguments, appeals, maybe deliberation as a way to try to win over hearts and minds, to advance a cause, and ultimately to enact change. That's sort of that framework. And you still see examples of that, although I think it's a lot less robust in terms of a kind of broad cultural phenomenon. I think you find a different kind of atmosphere and tonality and kind of energy to the social movements and public confrontations that we see today. Nevertheless, that's an important way of thinking about rhetoric and publicness. This week, we're going to go into more subtle forms of influence. When you think about rhetoric, you can think about persuasion, you can think about argumentation, you can think about symbols and symbolic action. And you can also think about influence. And I tend to think about rhetoric as kind of in a very broad sense as ways of influencing. Influencing minds, influencing bodies, whether it's consciously or unconsciously. Rhetoric can be thought of as the means by which, let's say subjects or authors or sources or senders influence audiences, viewers, users, right? Individuals, recipients of messages, and so on. And then the middle part is the how, right? What are the means by which certain groups attempt to influence and move and persuade other groups, right? And you can get pretty deep into really kind of subtle, ephemeral kinds of forces, right? So we start off talking about words, essentially, and arguments. But then as the class proceeds and as the 20th century proceeds, we start thinking about things like symbolic action, we start thinking about things like fashion, we start thinking about things like sport and culture, and the way that messages and appeals and influences of all kinds kind of swarm around us and captivate us and function as sources of equipment for living, providing meaning, providing comfort, providing some source of expressive outlet, right? So you can think about rhetoric in many different ways, servicing different kinds of needs, offering different kinds of agencies. But what's common amongst all of these different conceptions is rhetoric is doing something, right? And we're not talking about physical violence, we're not talking about force. There's debates about whether we're talking about coercion and manipulation. Is it still rhetoric if it's manipulation? I would argue that it still qualifies, right? Basically anything apart from physical violence where there's zero attempt to communicate or interact in a kind of conversant way, we're in that realm of rhetoric. And so this week we're going into even more subtle kinds of dynamics for thinking about influence. And so the theme is cultural power. Rhetoric is cultural power. And we've already been seeing a little bit of this with symbolic action and the ways that symbols and images and narratives can appeal to us, can speak to us, can move us around. You ever watched a movie that really moved you or changed your mind or upset you or pissed you off, right? All of that stuff is rhetoric kind of working on us in small ways and kind of daily, everyday kind of ways, right? So this week we want to try to get just a taste of this question of rhetoric as kind of power, right? When we think about power, it's a very tricky concept, and we're only going to just scratch the surface of the surface here. You know, you can think about power probably best as the ability to kind of get someone to do something that they might not want to on their own, right? Now, the question of like, does it have to be conscious or unconscious? If you're getting people to do things unconsciously and they're not even really aware that they're doing them, is that still power? Yeah, I think so, right? Is it still rhetorical? I think, yeah, I think we can talk about that kind of, again, that kind of unconscious realm of influence and being moved around, moving others around. So we could talk about power in many different ways, in terms of like governance, or in terms of money, in terms of resources, in terms of capital, in terms of status, and so on. But here we want to be thinking about it as like a kind of a cultural influence, right? As the ability to achieve certain outcomes regardless of the wills and desires of those who might resist, might disagree. And a big part of that is discursive. A big part of that is involving messaging, is involving ideas, is involving narratives and symbols. And, you know, Hallsby talks about myths and things, speech acts and stuff like that. So it's a huge subject, way bigger than we can really do justice to in a single week and just a couple of little readings. And so we're just trying to kind of hit some key things here. So I'm going to, again, go through the Hallsby selection for this week. But I'm really going to just focus on a couple of things. I'm interested in just a very quick look at this conception of ideology. And then I'm interested in the question of agency, and I'm interested in the persona stuff. But I'm not interested in the big, long discussion of Marx. I'm not really interested in the speech act stuff. And even though myth is interesting, it's a little bit more technical than we want to go. So we're going to just forego most of that stuff. You know, because we don't need to necessarily associate power with ideology. It's not like they're equivalent. It's not that they're the exact same thing. Ideology is not something I generally enjoy talking about, thinking about, writing about, because it's so hard to get your hands around. It's so gaseous. But it seems to point us in an important direction, which is that, you know, the realm of belief. That's what we're talking about when we talk about ideology, is sort of the realm of the beliefs that we hold. How we come into those beliefs. Who those beliefs serve. Do they serve me, or do they serve something else outside of me? Are they true, or are they not true, right? What are they based on, and what do they benefit, and how do they function? These are big questions. Now, Kenneth Burke, actually, the great Kenneth Burke, had a really interesting way of thinking about ideology that might suffice for our purposes here, because I just don't want to get bogged down in all of Hallsby's Marxist stuff there on ideology. It's a very specific take on ideology. It's about class, and it's about the means of production and all the rest of it, and class consciousness. And I feel like all that's really interesting, but it's a little bit historical and dated, and I think we can still talk about ideology in a useful way, but without getting bogged down in the details there. Now, Burke talked about ideology as like thinking about it like a ghost that comes down and invades your body and makes your body hop around in certain ways. And he says, and if a different ideology had come to inhabit your body, it might make your body hop around in different ways, right? So you can think about ideology as like a set of beliefs, an orientation, a way of viewing the world, and it comes to us through our experiences, through our social experiences, through our discursive experiences, the stuff that we're surrounded by, the books we read, the conversations we have, the schools that we go to, or the church, or the kind of cultural institutions that we're a part of. It is, broadly speaking, a kind of cultural training or education that generates how it is that we think of ourselves in relation to the world, right? But the thing about ideology is that we can oftentimes hold views that are actually harmful to ourselves. If you think about kind of the actual material conditions of our lives. There was a book that came out, I remember, during the George W. Bush presidency. You know, because George W. Bush was this like elite guy from, I think, Connecticut, who went to Yale, and he came from this super privileged family and very wealthy, but he had this kind of persona, and we'll get back to this idea of persona, but Bush had this persona of like a cowboy. He had the boots, and he had the talk down and everything. And so he tried to appeal to, and did appeal to, a lot of just like middle American types, right? Like the Midwest loved George W. Bush because he was, you know, just a regular old guy. He used to like to go down to his farm and like clear brush and so on. And he had this kind of persona as a, like an every guy, a simple guy. But his actual history was quite different. So there was this book that came out and it was called What's the Matter with Kansas by Thomas Frank, I think his name is. And it was this really interesting study of like, why is it that people in Kansas vote for a guy whose policies actually harm them, right? In terms of taxes, in terms of tax cuts, in terms of like everything that he's proposing actually would make life worse off for people in the districts that really, really loved him, right? But there's this cultural belief, there's these kind of ideologies and visions of the kind of world that he represents that explains their attachment to the candidate, even though the actual material policies might be really bad and disastrous, right? So when we're talking about ideology, we're often talking about like a disconnect between how we think about the world and how we think about ourselves in relation to the world and our actual conditions, material conditions, how we're living, things that are helping us and things that aren't helping us, you know? Like for instance, my sister married a farmer. I think I might have mentioned this before, but like she married this guy, Tim, an awesome guy, and he's a great husband, great dad and all that. But, you know, and they live on this massive 20,000 acre farm in southern Alberta, Canada. And, you know, he's got all the chemicals and he's got all the big machinery and he creates these commodity crops, and his whole life and their whole life is based off of like industrial farming practices. Because of how he lives, because of his kind of investment in a certain way of life, he has a certain kind of worldview that does not allow him to accept the realities of climate change, right? Even though it could work against him to keep doing what he's doing, to keep, you know, engaging in the same practices that he's engaging in with the chemicals and the, you know, the fairly harmful treatment of the soil, and what's happening over time, and the sprays that they use to keep the bugs away and the unintended consequences. It might not actually be in his interest, but the ideology of the lifestyle is such that it doesn't really permit thinking otherwise, right? And so ideology is sort of like the deterministic screen stuff that we talked about, is it creates a kind of a filter system, right? It informs how it is that you perceive the world, what comes in and what goes out, how you engage it. It acts as a kind of like a screen, as a filter. So when we think about ideology, we want to be thinking about kind of the beliefs that we hold that may or may not line up with how we live, and it may actually harm us. And then we ask ourselves, well, how did we come into these beliefs? How did they get in there? And that's really where rhetoric's involved, is in that kind of like the conjuring of certain kinds of worldviews out of narratives and arguments and appeals that we are surrounded by all the time. So already I'm just going to be scrolling down through the ideology stuff, just, you know, moving past the initial stuff. What is ideology? And even there, we're just going to take the barest little bit. We will define ideology as the religious, artistic, moral, and philosophical beliefs contained within and perpetuated by a society or culture, right? So a set of beliefs that we hold, that should do for our purposes. What are those beliefs and where do they come from and what do they produce? Those are the questions that we really kind of just want to focus on. So the basic premises of ideology, we're not going to get into class consciousness. We're not going to get into labor value and labor exploitation. We're not interested in the Marxist critique of the means of production and so on. It's fascinating, it's worth knowing, but not for our purposes. This business of estrangement and alienation, again, interesting, not for our purposes. From sign to myth. Myth is important, I think, for our purposes. How the big stories that we tell ourselves, you know, whether it's like Christmas or, you know, the story of our origin of our country. Every country has a kind of origin story. Myths about where we come from, who we are, our purpose, these kinds of kind of grand stories. Fascinating stuff, but again, a little bit more technical that we want to get into. I really want to just kind of launch into the business of ideology and agency. Disavowal, again, interesting concept, but we're not going to you know, make sure that we know that one. Ideograph, that's an attempt by a rhetoric scholar, McGee, to bring ideology in a specific way into rhetoric. We're not going to focus on ideograph. Part 2, agency, persona, and speech act. Forget about speech act, agency, and persona. That's all we want to focus on here. Now, agency is an important concept in rhetoric. I think we've talked about this. This business of the capacity to act, right? Do you have agency? Do you have the ability to act, to extend your will into the world in terms of action, in terms of results, in terms of things that you can do. Can you speak? Can you engage? Can you create something? Can you go build something? Can you decide to launch out and do something and create something and accomplish something? That's all agency, right? So ideology and agency are related in the sense that ideology is channeling, those beliefs are channeling us into certain kinds of behavioral directions, right? So agency is sort of the other side of ideology, right? It's a particular kind of action that we are engaging in based on how it is that we see the world and how we see ourselves in relation to the world, right? So agency is the capacity to act. Ideology limits the capacity to act. I don't know if it limits it so much as it channels it, right? And so it's basically saying this is the way to act based on the belief system that you hold. Now, in terms of rhetoric, in terms of, agency is this big kind of messy concept, and it goes back to Marx, and it's philosophical, and it's political, and all the rest of it. So a lot of social theories written about that. But ideology is not a term that's like unique to rhetoric. Rhetoric has been trying to deal with this business of ideology for some time, and one of the ways that it has managed to do that is through this concept of persona. So if we're thinking about the question of ideology and power with respect to rhetoric specifically, the persona kind of series of essays is probably one of our best ways into this whole discussion. So that's really what I'm going to focus on here. And this is the implied speaker or audience, right? And so let's get into the persona stuff. Now, Hallsby's noting 3 different kinds of agency. Basically, if you think about any kind of rhetorical transaction, which is speaker, audience, and speech, think about the Brock-Reedy stuff on the arguer as lover, as seducer, as rapist, right? You've got the speaker, you've got the audience, and then you've got the speech or the message or the medium, right? Now, you can think about the agency in any given rhetorical transaction as primarily coming through the speaker, right? That's the first one, rhetor-centered agency. But you can also maybe think about it as coming from the audience, where the rhetor has very little power or agency over the audience, is kind of asking or inviting the audience to do something. That would be audience-centric agency. And then the third is text-centered agency, where the medium itself has the power. Here's where I think about technology. That's what we're getting into next week, right? So technology, we don't necessarily think of technology or digital stuff as speech, but if you think about it as the medium between senders and receivers, then you can see how there's a lot of agency that's packed into these things. And that's exactly why I've become so fascinated in my own research on tech stuff, because of the agential powers. Why do we panic so much when we lose our phone? When was the last time you lost your phone? What's your first feeling? It's panic, because you've lost agency. Think about how much agency is inside those things. Think about the many ways that they enable you to act. They enable you to move around with Google Maps. They enable you to pay, banking, buying things, selling things, communicating. Your voice is extended. So the extension of yourself through these devices is an agential enhancer. So it definitely matters there. Again, we'll get back to that next week. All right, so the persona stuff is really the kind of the key pieces for what we're doing this week. And there's several essays that were written on persona. So this is getting down now. In the second part, we've got first persona, second persona, third, fourth, and even a fifth persona, or the eavesdropping persona. The second, third, and fourth ones, I think, are the important ones. Now, when you think about first persona, if you're giving a speech, if anyone's giving a speech, you're watching a speech, the persona is not so much the person, but the image of the person that is being conjured through the speech, right? This is, the Donald Trump persona. Donald Trump is a persona. Joe Biden has a persona, right? Whenever we're speaking in public, we are kind of representation of ourselves, and that we can think of that as the persona, the implied author. The second persona, this is the big key essay which comes from Edwin Black. It's the second persona, and it's basically a way of thinking about ideology in a rhetorical text. Now, the second persona is the implied audience, right? So if you go to a Trump rally, you're going to get the implied author, that's the first persona, but you're also going to get a second persona, which is the implied audience. And it's basically sort of a way of communicating, not necessarily explicitly, but a way of kind of letting an audience know who they are, who we are, right? And it happens subtly. And Black said that it happens through like stylistic tokens. So we use the language of dog whistles. think of along the lines of like a dog whistle, like a code, a little word here and there. If you use a certain kind of language, a certain kind of gesture, a certain kind of wink wink, you're creating this sense of like, this is who you are, this is who we are. So the second persona is the implied audience. You belong or you don't belong, right? So that is kind of how it is that ideology is communicated through rhetorical texts, is in this kind of subtle way through stylistic tokens like Black talked about, where we are getting clues and cues to the kind of people that we are meant to be based on not necessarily the explicit wording of the speech, but the more subtle stylistic stuff, little select word choices. That communicate that sense of you're in or you're not in. Which raises the third persona. The third persona is those who are not included in the second persona, right? So the excluded of the speech. If a speech implies its target audience, if it implies who belongs and who doesn't belong, then the third persona are those who are left out, the excluded, right? That's an important consideration. The fourth persona comes along with Charles Morris wrote this really terrific essay on J. Edgar Hoover and this business of the textual wink. This is the idea of passing. This is the idea of a certain kind of audience that is being gestured to as a kind of secondary aspect of the main audience, right? So we're kind of splitting the audiences, right? We're talking about passing, we're talking about winking, we're talking about collusion, we're talking about a speech that is kind of officially being addressed to this audience, but is winking at another kind of audience that gets what's going on there and is a kind of silent, private, almost secret collusion type audience, right? These messages conveyed messages about Hoover's own gender, which gay listeners would be in on, but would be unable to vocalize or address. The fourth persona is this collusive audience who's in on the speaker's message, but who act as a silent party for their dog whistles or doublespeak, right? And so there's levels of audience. There's maybe multiple audiences that can be engaged simultaneously. I'm thinking about like, I don't know, talking to your parents, right? You have, other friends are around and your parents are asking you questions and your parents don't know your entire vocabulary, and there's like little subtle words that you might be able to use around your friends where you're maybe making little jokes to each other and your parents are clueless, right? So you're following the official speech, but you're also kind of winking at your buddies or your friends or whatever, and so you see that kind of fourth persona going on there. And then the fifth is the eavesdropping audience. I'm not quite as familiar with if there's a rhetoric piece based on this, but I am familiar with Gloria Anzaldua's work. Really fascinating stuff on kind of the subtleties of language and side audiences kind of listening in. So that's kind of the main gist of what we want to be talking about here in terms of ideology, agency, persona. That's really enough for us to drill down on for our purposes. Now, how can we think about this as power? Well, texts, speeches, narratives, they speak to audiences, but not all audiences find themselves being spoken to, right? Have you ever been to a movie where you thought to yourself, this was not for me? In fact, I hated this movie because it represents views, beliefs that I don't share at all, right? So ideology can be mediated through texts of all kinds, through advertisements, right? So that's for me or that's not for me. I'm thinking about the big, ruckus that's happened recently with Bud Light, with, different audiences that it's trying to appeal to, and traditional audiences that feel like they've been kind of sold out or abandoned. In fact, I might create the assignment around this kind of stuff. So there was also like Gillette, the guy's razor brand, created these like very critical ads about sort of masculinity and so on, and there was this revolt. This is the kind of stuff that we're interested in here, is how it is that ideologies and different beliefs about the world are mediated through messages, through narratives, through advertisements, through movies, through TV programs, through social media kind of stuff, right? So the point is that ideology is coming at us. Beliefs about the world are coming at us through all kinds of texts that we're surrounded by all the time, every single day, every time we're reading stuff, watching stuff, going out to the movies. Even a restaurant can say to you through its ingredients or the stuff that it has or the stuff that it doesn't have, like, this is for you or this is not for you. if you're a vegan and you go to a steakhouse, this is not for you, right? Or if you're a carnivore and you go to a vegan restaurant, you feel these conflicts, right? So this is the domain and the realm of ideological mediation through speech, through text, through narratives, through media of all kinds. And these different personas are ways in which these kind of ideological beliefs are kind of circulated through these texts, through language, through stories, through narratives. And the question of agency is always kind of woven throughout this, because agency is, again, it's the ability to act, or it's being channeled to act in a different way, right? So like if you are, if you're a meat eater and you go to a vegan restaurant, you feel like your agency is being blocked, right? You feel maybe that frustration of resistance, or vice versa. You're a vegan and you have to go to a barbecue restaurant. My desire to live the way I want to live is being blocked right now, is being challenged by the narratives and the imagery and all this kind of symbols around me. And that creates conflict, and now we have ourselves a kind of a moment of resistance and frustration and what can happen, right? So agency is woven through all these little subtle things that we encounter, the places that we go, the places we shop, the spaces that we inhabit, and all the messaging that we're surrounded by. All right, this is already at 26 minutes. So even just those few concepts, I could go quite a bit further. But again, I don't want us to get bogged down in all this other extra stuff that's in the chapter. So I will try to remind everyone in an announcement to just focus on a little bit on ideology, and then think about agency and persona, and we're happy for this week. The other reading is by Foss and Griffin, which takes a critical look at sort of traditional rhetoric as very masculinist and kind of instrumental and power-dominating kind of approach. And they want to think about a different way of conceptualizing rhetoric as invitational, right? And it's a really interesting way of thinking about the possibilities for rhetoric, not just trying to accomplish some action, but as a way of kind of opening up the possibilities for exploration and discovery and being our full selves and understanding one another more deeply. The thing to be thinking about with the Foss and Griffin invitational essay is, where can it work successfully and where does it maybe run up against some problems in terms of what the purposes of any given rhetorical situation might be, okay? Anyway, so that's sort of it for this week. Ideology, agency, persona. Just try to get good on those basic concepts. If you have questions, I'm here to chat, and I'll get the next paper assignment up, and I hope we have some fun with it. So hope everyone's doing well and hanging in there, and talk soon.